Why German engineers said the U.S. proximity fuse was physically impossible. In the winter of 1944, a German anti-aircraft battery outside Antwerp fired on an American bomber formation. The crews loaded their shells, set their fuses by hand the way they had done 1,000 times before, and let them fly. The shells exploded, right on time, right at the correct altitude. And they missed, every single one. The bombers flew through the smoke and kept going. The German battery commander watched through his binoculars. He recalculated. He ordered another salvo. Again, the shells burst at exactly the right moment. Again, the bombers ignored them and flew away. He didn't understand it yet. But something had changed in that sky. Something so fundamental, so quietly revolutionary, that German engineers would later sit in post-war debriefing rooms and insist, with complete professional certainty, that what the Americans had built was physically impossible. They were wrong. But here's the thing, for a very long time, so was everyone else. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to a problem as old as warfare itself. How do you destroy something in the air? Sounds simple. It is not. Not even close. When you fire an artillery shell at an aircraft, you are not firing at where the aircraft is. You are firing at where the aircraft will be by the time your shell gets there. You are calculating speed, altitude, wind, temperature, the rotation of the Earth, the muzzle velocity of your gun, and about a dozen other variables, all in a matter of seconds, and then you are trusting that everything goes exactly right. And then, even if your aim is perfect, you have one more problem. A shell that flies past an airplane by 10 feet does nothing. It has to explode, and a shell only explodes when something triggers its fuse. By World War II, there were basically two kinds of fuses. A contact fuse, which exploded when it hit something solid, and a time fuse, which you set before firing to explode after a calculated number of seconds in the air. Contact fuses were nearly useless against aircraft. You had to actually hit the plane, and hitting a plane moving at 300 miles an hour with an artillery shell was like trying to thread a needle while someone drove you around in a car. Time fuses were better but still deeply imperfect. You set them by hand, based on your best calculation of where the target would be. A tiny error in estimation, the aircraft banking slightly, speeding up, slowing down, changing altitude by 100 feet, meant your shell exploded in empty air. During the First World War, it took an average of around 11,000 anti-aircraft shells to bring down a single enemy aircraft. 11,000. By the early years of World War II, improved guns and better range finders had brought that number down. But even with every advancement the world's best military engineers could devise, anti-aircraft gunnery remained a deeply inefficient business. You needed enormous quantities of ammunition, enormous numbers of guns, and enormous amounts of luck. Every major power on Earth understood this problem. Every major power on Earth was trying to solve it. Only one of them did. The idea, in its simplest form, was this. What if the shell could sense the airplane itself? What if, instead of relying on a man on the ground to correctly calculate when to explode, the shell could make that decision on its own, detecting the presence of the target and detonating at exactly the right moment without any human input whatsoever? Not a contact fuse, not a time fuse, a proximity fuse, a fuse that went off when it got close. Obvious, right, simple, even, except it wasn't, because here is what that idea actually required. You needed to pack inside an artillery shell, an object roughly 5.5 inches wide and about a foot long that would be fired from a gun at forces exceeding 20,000 times the pull of gravity, a complete miniature radar system. A radio transmitter, a radio receiver, an electronic circuit capable of detecting the reflection of its own signal bouncing back from a nearby object. A safety mechanism that prevented the shell from detonating in the gun barrel. And a power source reliable enough to keep all of this working for the full duration of the shell's flight. All of it had to survive being fired. All of it had to function at altitudes of 30,000 feet where the temperature was 60 degrees below zero. All of it had to work in the fraction of a second that a shell in an aircraft occupied the same tiny slice of sky. And all of it had to be manufactured by the millions, reliably and cheaply enough to be fired at the rate that modern warfare demanded. In 1940, the collective wisdom of the world's engineering community was roughly unanimous. On this point, it cannot be done. The vacuum tubes required for radio electronics were too fragile. They would shatter under the acceleration of firing. Even if they survived, the electronics would fail in the cold. Even if they didn't fail in the cold, the miniaturization required was beyond what manufacturing could achieve. Even if miniaturization was possible, the cost would be prohibitive. Even if the cost could be managed, the reliability would be too low to matter. German engineers looked at the problem and concluded it was insoluble with the technology of the era. British engineers looked at it and reached similar conclusions, though they kept trying. Japanese engineers barely considered it viable. Soviet engineers didn't have the industrial base to attempt it. But in a laboratory in Washington, D.C., a group of American scientists and engineers had decided that unanimous expert opinion was not, by itself, a reason to stop working. The man you need to know about is Merle Tuve. He is not famous. He should be. Merle Tuve was a physicist from South Dakota who had grown up in a small town and gone to the University of Minnesota and then Johns Hopkins and then worked his way into the upper tier of American scientific life in the 1930s. He was the kind of scientist who didn't just think about problems abstractly, he built things. He had been one of the early researchers in nuclear physics. He had worked on radar. He understood electronics at a level that crossed the boundary between theoretical and practical in a way that relatively few scientists of his generation managed. When the war started and the National Defense Research Committee began pulling in America's best scientific minds to work on military problems, Tuve was assigned to the Proximity Fuse project at the Applied Physics Laboratory, which had been hastily established at Johns Hopkins University in Silver Spring, Maryland. He walked into a problem that most of his peers had already walked away from. And he started building. The first problem was the vacuum tubes. Standard vacuum tubes of the 1940s were glass cylinders the size of a small light bulb, fragile enough that you could shatter them by setting them down too hard. Firing them inside an artillery shell would reduce them to powder before the shell left the barrel. Tuve's team needed tubes that could survive acceleration equivalent to 20,000 times the force of gravity. There was no such tube. Nobody had ever needed one. So they made one. The engineers at the Applied Physics Laboratory worked with tube manufacturers to redesign the vacuum tube from the inside out. They changed the internal support structure. They changed the glass formulation. They changed the way the electrodes were mounted inside. They tested tube after tube after tube, firing them in guns, examining the wreckage, changing the design, firing again. It took months. It produced failure after failure. Tubes that shattered in the barrel. Tubes that survived the firing but failed when the circuits tried to activate them. Tubes that worked perfectly in the laboratory but couldn't handle the cold at altitude. But slowly and painfully and expensively in terms of time and money and the collective nerves of the people doing the work, a tube that could survive began to take shape. The second problem was miniaturization. Everything in the fuse had to fit inside a cylinder roughly the diameter of a soda can. The transmitter, the receiver, the antenna, the logic circuit that compared the outgoing signal with the returning reflection and triggered the detonation when the reflection reached a certain strength. The battery alone was a nightmare. Standard batteries of the era were too large, too heavy, and too unreliable at low temperatures. Tuve's team ended up developing a new type of battery, a wet cell design that used centrifugal force from the shell's own spin to activate itself. When the shell was fired and began spinning, the centrifugal force threw the battery's electrolyte into contact with the electrodes, activating the power supply. Before the shell was fired, the battery was inert. The shell literally turned itself on. This was not a refinement of existing technology. This was an invention, a new thing that had not existed before. There is a detail here that tends to get lost when people tell this story, and it is the detail that I think matters most. The people working on the proximity fuse at the Applied Physics Laboratory in 1941 were not working in a comfortable research environment with unlimited time and resources. They were working in buildings that had been hastily converted for laboratory use, with equipment that was often improvised, under pressure from military commanders who needed this weapon yesterday and could not understand why scientists needed so much time to build something so small. A researcher named Harry Diamond, who would go on to have one of the most distinguished careers in American physics, kept a personal diary during this period. He wrote, "We fire 100 shells and get back 100 broken tubes. We make changes. We fire another 100, 60 broken, 40 intact. We make more changes. We fire another 100. Today, for the first time, we got 80 intact. We went home feeling like we had won a war. We had not won a war. We had gotten 80 intact tubes. Tomorrow we try again." That entry was written in April 1941. 14 months before a working proximity fuse would be test-fired for the first time. 14 months of 80 intact tubes feeling like a victory. The British were working on a similar problem and had made significant progress of their own. In one of the most consequential acts of scientific cooperation in the history of warfare, Britain and the United States agreed to share their research openly, pooling everything they had learned, every failure as well as every success, in the common cause of building this weapon before Germany or Japan could. The British contribution was significant. Their work on miniaturized radio circuits, in particular, helped solve problems that had been stalling the American program. And the Americans, with their vastly larger industrial base and manufacturing capacity, were better positioned to take a working prototype and turn it into a weapon that could be produced by the millions. This partnership, messy, sometimes competitive, occasionally fractious, but ultimately productive, is one of the unsung achievements of the Allied war effort. By the summer of 1942, Tuve's team had something. Not a perfect weapon, not a weapon that worked every time, but a proximity fuse that worked often enough, reliably enough, to be worth testing under real conditions. The first live test happened at sea. The fuse was fired against drone aircraft, pilotless radio-controlled planes, over the Chesapeake Bay. The military observers watched through binoculars from a ship. The gun fired, the shell rose, and the drone, a target that had to actually be close enough to trigger the fuse's radar, came apart in midair. The fuse had worked. The observers went quiet for a moment. Then someone said, quietly, that this changes everything. It did, but there was a problem. A serious one. If proximity fuses were used over land and a dud shell fell into enemy hands, German engineers could examine it. They could reverse engineer it. They could potentially develop countermeasures, electronic jamming systems that could prevent the fuse from triggering, or even cause Allied proximity fuses to detonate prematurely, turning the weapon against the people who had built it. The decision was made at the highest levels. Proximity fuses would be deployed at sea. First, against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific, where dud shells would fall into the ocean and be unrecoverable. They would not be used over land in Europe until commanders were confident the Germans could not recover a dud. January 5, 1943. The USS Helena. The Pacific Ocean, near Guadalcanal. The Japanese were sending aircraft against American ships in the waters around Guadalcanal almost every day. American anti-aircraft gunners had been fighting these attacks for months. With conventional time-fused ammunition, with the usual results, enormous expenditure of shells, occasional kills, and a persistent sense that the aircraft were getting through far too often. On the morning of January 5, a formation of Japanese aircraft appeared on the radar screens. The Helena's gun crews loaded their shells. But these shells were different. These shells had the new fuse. The aircraft came in, the Helena's guns fired, and the Japanese formation came apart in a way that the gun crews had never seen before. Aircraft that should have flown through the bursts, as aircraft had always flown through bursts, instead tumbled out of the sky. The fuse had triggered not on a timer, not on contact, but because the shell had passed close enough to the aircraft's fuselage for its radar return to reach the detection threshold. The shell had sensed the airplane and killed it. It worked. Word spread through the Pacific Fleet with the speed that important news always travels in a military at war. Other ships received the new ammunition. Kill rates against Japanese aircraft began to rise in a way that was dramatic enough to be impossible to explain as coincidence. American ships that had been suffering serious aircraft losses found themselves shooting down attackers at rates that their commanders had considered impossible under normal circumstances. The Japanese noticed. They couldn't explain it. They changed tactics, coming in lower, coming in faster, coming in at night. But the fuse worked in darkness as well as daylight, and it worked against low-flying aircraft as well as high-flying ones. The tactical changes helped, but they didn't solve the Japanese problem. The proximity fuse was not a secret weapon anyone told them about. It was a secret weapon they had to deduce from the fact that they were dying. In Europe, the strategic situation was different. The fear of German recovery of a dud fuse had kept the proximity fuse out of the ground war. But by late 1944, American commanders were facing a crisis that changed the calculus. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944. German forces under Field Marshal Walter Model launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, a surprise attack that tore a hole in the Allied line and threatened to reach the port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies and potentially forcing a negotiating Peace. The weather closed in. The skies over the Ardennes turned gray and then white and then impossible. Allied air power, which had been the decisive factor in almost every battle since D-Day, was grounded. The aircraft couldn't fly, and without air support, American infantry in places like Bastogne found themselves surrounded, underarmed, freezing, and outnumbered. Bastogne. You've heard of it. The 101st Airborne. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. The reply of nuts to the German surrender demand, the heroism and the cold and the desperate fighting in the snow. What most histories of Bastogne mention only briefly, if at all, is what happened to the German artillery. German artillery was pounding Bastogne around the clock. Shells were dropping on positions that should have been impossible to hit accurately from the distances involved. American soldiers were dying not in firefights but while crouching in foxholes, struck by shell fragments from explosions they couldn't predict and couldn't avoid. Then, on December 16, a decision was made. General Omar Bradley, commanding American ground forces, approved the use of proximity fuses in artillery shells over land in Europe for the first time. The 155 mm howitzers of the American artillery units began loading a different kind of shell. What happened next became one of the most effective demonstrations of a new weapon in the history of artillery warfare. And it came about through a piece of physics so elegant that it seems, in retrospect, almost obvious, though nobody had managed to think of it and build it for the entire history of gunpowder warfare up to that point. When an artillery shell with a proximity fuse approached the ground, it didn't detonate on contact. It detonated when it was somewhere between 5 and 30 feet above the surface. This is called an airburst. And an airburst does something that a ground detonating shell does not. When a shell explodes on the ground, the blast and fragments travel outward and upward in a cone. A soldier in a foxhole is largely protected. The rim of the hole and the earth itself absorb most of the lethal energy. Ground detonating artillery is devastating in the open but far less effective against dug-in infantry. When a shell explodes in the air above a foxhole, the fragments travel downward into the hole. There is nowhere to hide. The foxhole, which has been a soldier's primary protection for a century of modern warfare, becomes a trap. German infantry in the Ardennes had dug foxholes and trenches in the frozen Belgian earth, the way German infantry had always dug in under artillery fire, the way every army in the world trained its soldiers to do. The proximity fuses found them anyway. Survivors from German units in the Ardennes described the experience in post-war accounts with a consistency that speaks to how profoundly it affected them. The shells came in, and instead of the familiar crash and concussion of a ground burst, something that experienced soldiers could often survive by getting low enough, fast enough, the shells exploded overhead. The fragments came down. Men who thought they were sheltered found they were not. One German sergeant, whose account was collected by American military historians after the war, said this: "We did not understand it at first. We would get into cover, into the holes we had dug, and the shells would still find us. I thought the Americans had developed some kind of guided shell. Something that could see us. I know now that is not exactly right. But at the time, in those weeks, that is what it felt like. It felt like the shells could see." The effect on German morale in the Ardennes was significant. But the effect on German engineering pride was something else. When the battle ended and German officers and technical experts began examining captured American ammunition and equipment, they encountered the proximity fuse for the first time up close. They took them apart. They analyzed the components. They traced the circuits. And then they sat down with their calculations and their understanding of what was physically achievable with the manufacturing technology and electronic components of the era. Their conclusion was one of the most extraordinary technical assessments produced by any military during World War II. It was not possible, not in any dismissive sense, not in the sense of a man refusing to believe what he sees. It was a careful, professional engineering assessment that said, the tolerances required to manufacture a vacuum tube that could survive artillery firing at scale, reliably, cheaply enough to be used by the millions, these tolerances exceeded what mass manufacturing could achieve. The miniaturization required for the antenna and detection circuits exceeded what they believed could be done with 1944 electronics. The battery design, self-activating through centrifugal force, was something they had not conceived of and could not immediately explain. Their conclusion was that either the Americans had achieved manufacturing breakthroughs that German industry had not managed, or the weapon had been developed over many more years than was plausible, or some component of what they were examining was not what it appeared to be. They were not wrong to be confused. The proximity fuse represented a genuine technological leap. The vacuum tubes had been redesigned. From the ground up, the manufacturing processes had been invented specifically for this weapon. The battery was an original invention. Every component had required solutions that did not exist before someone sat down and created them. The Germans could have built it. Given enough time, enough resources, enough of the particular kind of sustained scientific industrial cooperation that the project had required. But they hadn't been working on it. They hadn't believed it was possible. And by the time they held a working example in their hands, it was too late to matter. The numbers tell part of the story. Against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific, early proximity fuse ammunition achieved roughly 3 times the kill rate of conventional time-fused rounds. 3 times. With the same guns, the same gun crews, the same targeting systems, just a different fuse on the shell. During the Ardennes campaign, American artillery commanders reported that proximity fuse rounds were approximately 5 times more effective against dug-in infantry than equivalent ground burst rounds. 5 times. In the mathematics of warfare, that is not an improvement. That is a transformation. By the end of the war, the United States had manufactured approximately 22 million proximity fuses. The industrial mobilization required to produce them, new factories, new manufacturing techniques, a workforce trained to produce components to tolerances that American industry had never previously attempted, was itself a significant part of the American war effort. The total cost of the proximity fuse program, from initial research through the end of the war, was approximately $1 billion in 1945 money. Adjusted for inflation, that is somewhere in the range of $15 to $17 billion today. It was worth every penny. There is a moment that I keep coming back to when I think about this story. It is late 1944. The Battle of the Bulge is grinding toward its conclusion. American artillery is firing proximity fuses over the frozen forests of Belgium. German soldiers are discovering, with a combination of terror and professional bewilderment, that their foxholes no longer protect them. And somewhere in a laboratory in Maryland, now years in the past, from the perspective of the shells falling on the Ardennes, Merle Tuve and Harry Diamond and the dozens of other scientists and engineers who worked on this problem are no longer there. They have moved on to other things. The weapon has left their hands. It belongs to the artillerymen now. But the work they did in those first impossible years, when the vacuum tubes shattered and the batteries failed and the experts said it cannot be done, that work is falling now, in the cold Belgian air, toward the German lines. Harry Diamond's diary entry from April 1941 comes back. Today, for the first time, we got 80 intact tubes. We went home feeling like we had won a war. 3.5 years later, they had The proximity fuse is classified by military historians as one of the 3 most important technological contributions to the Allied victory in World War II. The other 2 are radar and the atomic bomb. Radar is famous. The atomic bomb is the most famous thing in the history of warfare. The proximity fuse is the one that most people have never heard of. And yet, in a very real sense, it is the most impressive of the 3. The atomic bomb was built by thousands of people working for years at unlimited cost on a project of singular national priority. Radar was developed across multiple countries over more than a decade. The proximity fuse was built by a relatively small team of scientists who were told the problem was insoluble, who had 2 years and a budget that looked enormous but was modest by the standards of the Manhattan Project, and who produced a weapon that worked the first time it was fired in combat and kept working every time it was needed for the rest of the war. The German engineers who examined it after the Ardennes said it was physically impossible. What they meant was that it was beyond what they had imagined was achievable. Merle Tuve and his team had imagined differently. They went home one evening in 1941 feeling like they had won a war because 80 vacuum tubes survived being fired from a gun. And then they went back to work.